Hey YouTube, just wanted to make a quick video before I have to go become a productive member of society. And it's a video on why agnostic atheism is stupid, or why I think it's stupid. And the concept of agnostic atheism is the notion that atheism refers to belief and agnosticism refers to knowledge. So therefore, they're not mutually exclusive categories. Fine. To some degree, I don't need them to be mutually exclusive categories. But I just don't buy that there's any reason to really sit on this point and say this is how it is. There's something imperialist in this, in a certain way. The need to sort of claim agnostics as our own, or people who don't want to identify as atheists. And I don't think there's any good reason for that, and I will get into all of that momentarily. But first of all, I want to point out that knowledge has always been classically defined as justified true belief. Knowledge is a kind of belief. Given that's the case, it seems that the distinction required between knowledge and belief is unstable. It doesn't quite work as well as it would appear on first glance. The other thing too is that this has a heavy emphasis on the history of the word gnosis, but there's a problem here in that gnosis doesn't have a one-to-one relationship with the modern word knowledge. Gnosis is a spiritual state. To some degree, it would render, in an etymological sense, a Gnostic atheist would actually be a radical contradiction in terms. Because again, gnosis is it's a religious term. It's not knowledge like I know that I have a Dwight Schrute bobblehead doll. No, it's not knowledge in that sense. It's knowledge in, a deeply cultivated religious sense, in an aesthetic sense. This is hugely important because it lends more to why, WTF? Why do you need this distinction? The other side of the coin is that even if we grant that etymologically speaking, Gnostic means knowledge in any relevant sense, even if we grant that, then what's the justification for saying that atheism refers to belief? There's no etymological justification. There's no... I don't even see there as being a historical justification. It doesn't seem to me that atheism is really a question of belief. It seems that atheism is a question of your stance on a particular issue. And the fact is, this formalizing method, this way of saying, this is what an atheist is, and all you agnostics, you're really just atheists, and you don't know it yet. You're just confused about the terms. Yeah, that's cool. As if we get to tell people how they self-identify, because that's absolutely sane. The way I would see it, first of all, agnosticism has a history, right? Thomas Huxley and so on. So, given the history of agnosticism, it seems to me to be absurd to say that agnostics are atheists. The whole point is to carve out a space where, if we say that there's basically two schools of atheism, this is an oversimplification, but if we say that there's one group of people who affirm the proposition God does not exist, there's another group of people who reject the proposition God exists. It's a subtle difference, but it is there. I think that this is the core between the difference between positive atheism and negative atheism. The way I see agnostics is saying that answer is, or I can't give you that answer. It's futile to it, like in principle, to attempt to answer that question. I have no position. The answer to the question of God's existence is outside. I can neither affirm or reject anything about it for basic epistemological reasons. This is the agnostic position. I see this as being distinct from the other two. And I don't see any reason to dominate this group of people, or to claim them, to put a flag in their camp and say you are really ours. No, I think that's I think it's kind of violating, actually. The other thing too is that if I say I'm an agnostic atheist, it doesn't seem like the concession to not have knowledge on the subject stops me from taking a really strong stance and arguing about it, and making recommendation in politics, and making, again, just taking really strong stances on related issues. If that's the case, if it doesn't prevent me from doing that, then what benefit would there be to being Gnostic anything? It seems to me to be like an absurd category. There's no upside to saying, I am, I know this. In some way, it devalues the word knowledge. The other thing I wanted to point to, which is the notion that all people who don't all people who aren't theists are atheists. That idea. There's another discourse that's based. There's another ism that's based on a rejection, right? Which is anarchism. Anarchism has a history, and it has a really interesting history, and it overlaps with the history of atheism, particularly in Mikhail Bakunin's God and the State, which is where Christopher Hitchens gets all his best lines. But technically, etymologically, the word anarchy comes from Greek for no authority. We might be better understood as no state, no political authority, no government. It doesn't follow then that everybody who rejects the necessity of the state is an anarchist by definition. This is actually the exact same argument formally as the atheist argument, as this agnostic. Everybody who rejects, or everybody who does not answer yes to the question God exists is an atheist. Like, that's ridiculous. In the same way, everybody who doesn't answer yes to the question, is the state a necessary part of society, they're not necessarily anarchists. Even though we could say that there are archists and anarchists. Like, you could play this whole game with anarchism. But the fact is, and I mean, the other great school that rejects the necessity of the state would be Marxists. If you read Marx, he explicitly says that the state would have to dissolve in a communist society because the state itself is something that propagates class structures. So, Marx rejects the necessity of the state. Bakunin rejects the necessity of the state. We call one a communist, we call the other an anarchist, and they hated each other, too. If you look back to the First International, if you look back at the history of that, they hated each other. Marx actually pushed Bakunin out of the First International. And then in Soviet Russia, there was actually in, I think, 1920, maybe, there was actually a purge. And the anarchists harshly criticized Soviet Russia. If you look at Emma Goldman's My Disillusionment in Russia, you'll see a history of the October Revolution. If you read Leon Trotsky's A History of the October Revolution, a history of the Russian Revolution, you'll see a very different picture of that. One's from an anarchist and one's from a communist. If you go to George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, you'll find out very quickly that anarchists and communists have not historically gotten along. They don't even attempt to identify with one another, even though most of their systems are, in line with each other. Anarchism and most schools of communism, people, and I'm here thinking of people like Rosa Luxemburg or Karl Kautsky or Anton Pannekoek or who are called left Marxists, right? They have a lot more in common with people like Emma Goldman and Mikhail Bakunin and the anarchist tradition. Those two schools have a lot more in common than the left Marxists have with the right Marxists, people like Joseph Stalin, but at the same time, we still lump them together as communists. So my point is that labeling is a funny thing, but I don't think that there's any need to tell somebody, no, you're not really an agnostic. You just don't understand what these terms mean. No, they understand just fine. And they have a history to support them. There's a reason why they go for this. And there's no reason to say that everybody who rejects the existence of God is necessarily an atheist. Just like, again, the necessity of the state. If you reject that, you're not necessarily an anarchist. We should understand that atheism has a tradition, and we should own up to that, and we should be happy about that. And if you don't identify with that tradition, you're not an atheist. If you don't identify with, again, the history might be something like, ancient Greece, David Hume, again, Bakunin, Proudhon, through Nietzsche, through Marx. You could give out a whole Bertrand Russell. You could give a whole. You could teach a class on the history of atheism. You know what I mean? And there's a tradition that's obvious in that class. It seems to me that merely rejecting the claim God exists, or merely not affirming the proposition God exists, is not sufficient to claim that someone is an atheist. And I think that we should recognize that we have a tradition, that people need to identify with that tradition in order to in order to self-identify as an atheist. Because even if we don't think that way, people who aren't atheists do. Yeah, so that seems to be the fact of the matter. Now, meanwhile, if you want to identify as an agnostic atheist, that's fine. If that's just easier for you, fine. I think it's stupid, but, like, I'm not going to tell you how to self-identify. And I think that's the moral of the video. That's the real, like, point, is that it's insulting to tell somebody how to self-identify. And that's my rant for the day. Comment, subscribe, and yeah.